Our focus in our study now is Spain, the nation of Spain, because in Spain a Christianity develops that is different from other countries. First of all, Spain is different from other countries. One thing that makes it different is it's a peninsula. We call it the Iberian Peninsula. The word Spain itself means hidden, obscure, remote land. And in a way, it is isolated from the rest of Europe. But then so is Italy. So Italy, in one sense, also has a very different history. And England is an island, so it has a very different history. But we're talking about Spain tonight. In Spain, we find different geographical areas. There's the Meseta, which is a plain in the middle of, the rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain, as the song goes. And that's the plain of Spain. Then there's Galatia, and the area of the Basques, and Catalonia, and Valencia. Valencia's in the south. Catalonia's in the north and east part of Spain. The basic population of Spain, the basic ethnic stock, if you please, is Celt-Iberian. And the Celtic people, coming in about 4th century BC, pretty well populated most of Europe. But there was an earlier people there called the Iberian people, and the Celts came in and mixed with the Iberian people, so we have the Celt-Iberian people. Now, the Basque people are totally different. They speak a language that's unrelated. Nobody knows where they came from. Their culture is different, and they're still there today, and there's a lot of tension between the Basques and the Spanish government today. And they've been there a long, long time, and nobody knows anything about them as far as their background is concerned. In the outline of Spanish history, the Celt-Iberian period is before the Romans, so we'll say 2000 BC to 200 BC. The Romans took over in 200 BC from the Carthaginians. The Carthaginians had come to control a good part of Spain. Carthage is a city in North Africa, and they had used Spain as a colony of theirs. Romans conquered Carthage and took over Spain. And so from 200 BC to AD 400, that's a Roman period. And during that time, the Romans gave to the Spanish people their language, because if you know anything about Spanish, you know Spanish is a Latin derivative language, very close to Latin. They gave to the Spanish people law and a sense of unity, and everywhere the Romans went, they gave law and unity. But then there was a time when the Roman Empire, in the West at least, not in the East, but in the West, collapsed. And Germanic tribes invaded. And these Germanic tribes took over the Western Roman Empire. And different German tribes settled in different places. And it so happened that a German tribe, a group called the Visigoths, settled in Spain. Visigoth means wise Goths. And they took over Spain about 415. And they held Spain until 711. In 711, Spain was conquered by the Muslims, by the Islamic people who crossed over from North Africa. And so there's an Islamic period from 711 until 1031, and then there's a period where Christians and Muslims fought each other from 1031 until 1492. And then we have the reemergence of a Christian Spain. So it's a very interesting history. It's a very diverse history, with Celts, Iberians, Carthaginians, Romans, Visigoths, Muslims, Christians. But we want to look, of course, particularly at Christianity in Spain. When did it come in? Well, the Bible says that Paul planned to go to Spain. So traditionally, it is believed the Apostle Paul took the gospel to Spain somewhere between 63 and 67 AD. And when Spain became Christian, there was never in Spain at any time any kind of separation between church and state. There was always a throne-altar alliance. When the Visigoths came in the 5th century, then Spain was already primarily a Christian country, but the Visigoths were Christians themselves. Now, they were Arian Christians. Arian Christians did not believe essentially in the divinity of Jesus Christ. Arian Christians believed that Jesus was a created being, and therefore he was not God. He was inferior to God. But eventually, the Visigoths accepted the belief of the church, which was expressed in the Nicene Creed. That is, that Jesus is not created, he's eternal, co-eternal with the Father, and he is God. They did that in 587, when their king Recared accepted the Nicene faith. The Visigothic capital was at Toledo. Originally, it had been in South France. The Visigoths first made a capital at Toulouse in South France, and then they moved on into Spain and established a capital at Toledo. They ruled as an hereditary monarchy. They ruled also as a minority. They were outnumbered 5-1. The Spanish people outnumbered them 5-1. So you have a small Visigothic German minority ruling over the nation of Spain. It was a rural time throughout the Western Empire. Cities collapsed, trade collapsed, people lived on farms, and that's the way it was in Spain. The culture of the Visigoths was very much like the Romans. They tried to imitate the Romans. These Goths, especially the Visigoths, just wanted to be good Romans. They'd lived along the border for a long time, and they admired the Romans. And now that they were actually ruling, they saw themselves as ruling in the name of Rome, in the name of the Roman emperor in Constantinople, and they tried to copy the Romans. Let me give you an example of that. You all know about Spanish bullfights. Every Spanish city has an arena where they have the bullfights. Well, that's just a copy of the bloody type of games and gladiatorial games and fighting with animals that the Romans had done. So they continue the Roman way of life. Now, in their religion, from the very beginning, there's one thing that I want you to notice about Spanish Christianity. It's very intense. They take it seriously. They feel it passionately. The Spanish are 100% committed people when it comes to Christianity. And that's the way it was even in the Visigothic period. Now, in this early period, they didn't produce many great scholars. Let me tell you that all of the scholars of the Middle Ages, with very few exceptions, were churchmen, were clergymen. The great writers, the great thinkers were all bishops and people and monks and people in the church. They were the learned people. They are the ones who contributed to the culture. And that speaks well for the church and for the fact that it was producing an educated clergy. Now, the example that we have in Spain is Isidore, the Bishop of Seville, who wrote a book called the Etymologies. It is a word study book, a book that examines the meaning and the origin of different words. And it was used as a standard textbook in schools for hundreds of years. Now, some of the definitions might be challenged today. Some of the words appear to even perhaps have been made up. But at any instance, it was, for its time, a very comprehensive and relatively well-done scholarly work. Isidore was not only the writer of the etymologies, he was a scientist and, of course, a bishop. But then in 711, a man named Tariq crossed the straits, the narrow body of water that separates Spain from North Africa. And as he entered into Spain from North Africa, this Muslim adventurer, soldier, he found a huge rock there. And this was his rock that would commemorate his would-be conquest of Spain. And he named it after himself. The Arabic word for rock or mountain is Jib. Al means of, and you know it as Gibraltar. Jib al-Tariq, the rock of Tariq. He was quickly joined by a man named Musa, that's Arabic for Moses, and the two of them will conquer Spain. And by this time, the Visigothic government was fairly corrupt, and it fell quickly into the hands of the Muslims. Devout Christians who did not want to live under Islamic rule followed the remnants of the Visigothic army into the mountains of Spain in the north, to an area known as Asturias. And Asturias was never Islamic. It remained Christian throughout all of this time. And those Christians remained isolated up there in the mountains for hundreds of years, biding their time and waiting for an opportunity to reconquer the Iberian Peninsula. Meanwhile, the Muslims coming in took over the Visigothic capital of Toledo, and from 711 until 750, that was their capital. If you go to Toledo today, you will find a huge building which is called the Alcazar. That means the castle in Arabic, that is still standing there, although it was destroyed during the Spanish Civil War in 1930s, I think about 1938, 39, but was rebuilt. And that was the capital, so to speak, fortress in Toledo of the Muslims. In 732, an expeditionary force went out from Spain to see about the possibility of Spain conquering France. I might tell you that there had been an earlier master plan on the part of the Islamic world to conquer the Christian world. But that meant they had to conquer Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. In 718, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, Leo III, soundly defeated the Muslims both by land and sea, and that stopped that plan in its tracks. And the idea was to get through at Constantinople and then to break through from Spain, and the Muslims would then put Christian Europe in a vice. But it failed because the main army was defeated before they got to Constantinople. So the governor, Abd al-Rahman, simply took an expeditionary force up into France and got as far as Tours when the French leader Charles Martel turned him back in 732 and, of course, gained a good deal of prestige from doing that. A few years later in 750, a gentleman back in Damascus, which at this time was the capital of the Islamic Empire in Syria, by the name of Abbas, decided to make a bid for power. He invited all of the princes of the ruling family of the Islamic Empire, and this was the Umayyad family, to a banquet. And after he had fed them a wonderful meal, his men entered the banquet hall and cut off the heads of these princes. Now, one of the Umayyad princes was late arriving. He was the governor of Spain. He was a relative, the nephew of the Abd al-Rahman who was turned back by Charles Martel in 732. His name was also Abd al-Rahman. And Abd al-Rahman comes in a wee bit late. Now, this is one time it was good to be late, to be when you were invited to dinner, because he got in late and he discovered what was happening. And he thought, I'd better get out of here. So he turned and ran. This would make a wonderful story for Hollywood to do. And he managed to get back to Spain and get out of the clutches of Abbas, who went on to be called Abbas al-Safa, which in Arabic means Abbas the Bloodshedder. And Abbas went on to establish the Abbasid Caliphate, which controlled the Islamic Empire from 750 to 1055. And he in turn, or his successor I should say, will move the Islamic capital to Baghdad and build Baghdad as the new capital. Meanwhile, Abd al-Rahman got back to Spain safely, and of course now he is the only Umayyad prince left alive, and he sets up his own government in Spain, moved the capital from Toledo to Cordoba, and now we speak of the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba, which exists from 750 until 1031. And it was a glorious rule in Spain. Now Charlemagne, the emperor of the French, tried twice to destroy the Islamic Empire in Spain, the Umayyad Caliphate, in 777 and in 801. He did take the city of Barcelona, and the area around Barcelona is called the Spanish March. He took that away from the Muslims, but he did not take all of Spain by any means. But if any of you have read the Song of Roland, or the Song of Roland, it is the story of the captain of the rear guard of Charlemagne's forces and his betrayal and his death. And it's one of the great epic poems of the Middle Ages. The greatest ruler of Islamic Spain was Abd al-Rahman III, who ruled between 912 and 961. He had a huge navy. He'd made Spain a powerful country. He was feared and respected all over Western Europe, and he brought about a time of peace and prosperity. Cordoba was the greatest intellectual center in Western Europe during this time and had a population of 500,000 people. All kinds of industries. Very, very prosperous economically. At this point, Economically, and at this point, culturally, intellectually, Spain was probably 2 centuries ahead of the other countries in Western Europe. Now you might ask, why is that the case? These are not even Christians. Well, for one thing, Muslims were willing to utilize the learning of the ancient world. They had a philosophy where they could put their religion in one box and their science in another box, and never the twain would meet. Whereas Christians felt they needed to harmonize their thought. And so with that kind of a viewpoint, they made great strides in science, in math, in philosophy, in literature, technology, economics, and so forth, because they were willing to employ the learning of the Greeks and the Romans. That's one reason for that. And I know when we talk about this, we want to say, that sounds like a good thing. And yet I want to remind you that Western Europe was trying to create a Christian community where the emphasis was not so much on these material things as it was upon the spiritual things. Now, it is true that the Muslims in Spain, like the Muslims everywhere, were very tolerant of Christians and Jews, do not believe otherwise. They were tolerant. They allowed the Jews to become tax collectors. They allowed people to keep their religion, but in any Islamic land, a Christian could not evangelize, and he had to pay a tax. Otherwise, he could stay. Non-Islamic people living in Spain were called muladis, and converts from Christianity or Judaism to Islam were called Mozarabs. Now, in 1031, the great Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba collapsed due to internal corruption, and the caliphate divided up into 26 separate Islamic states called taifas, with power concentrated not at Cordoba anymore, but at the city of Seville, with a sultan. And if you have a chance to go to Spain, visit Toledo, visit Cordoba, which is absolutely amazing what you're going to see there, especially the mosque. Visit Seville, where you see the palace of the sultan, and then go to Granada, the last stronghold of Islamic Spain, where you see the Alhambra. Now, this collapse of the Umayyad Caliphate is exactly what the Christians had been waiting for hundreds of years. Their opportunity to make their move. Now, up in Asturias had in 1000, just 31 years before the fall of the Caliphate, divided into 2 separate states, Leon and Castillo. And Alfonso VI in 1065 became the king of both of those countries. Meanwhile, Sancho Ramirez became the king of Aragon and Navarre, the western part of the Spanish March, that area that had been conquered by Charlemagne. The eastern part was Barcelona. Aragon was simply an area that had become independent of the Muslims, did become independent in 1035. So these 2 kings now become very strong Christian kings, Alfonso VI and Sancho Ramirez. And these 2 kings went together and took the offensive against the Muslims. They were aided by French, Norman, and Burgundian knights. And you always want the Norman knights to come and help you when you do anything, because Norman knights are Vikings and they love to fight, and they're really good. So anytime there's any kind of adventure, any type of conquest, be sure and get the Norman knights on your side. In 1085, these 2 Christian kings captured the city of Toledo. Now, many of you have heard of the Cid, or have seen the movie with Charlton Heston playing the role, El Cid. Now, El Cid was a real person, and he lived at this time. His name was Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar. And he often fought for the Christians, but he was also known to fight for the Muslims. And that's what you don't see in the movie. He was a soldier of fortune who fought for whoever paid him the most, and he switched back and forth. But generally, he fought for the Christians. Now, the Muslims were on the run. Meanwhile, in North Africa, a radical group had taken control in North Africa called the Almoravids. The reason they took control is that there were weaknesses beginning to appear in the Islamic states all over the Middle East. And when Muslims have problems, internal problems, they usually conclude, we have been unfaithful to Allah, and Allah is punishing us. And so that means we need to tighten up, and we need to be more strict about our religion. And so the Almoravids came in with a message to tighten things up, to be much more strict about keeping the Sharia, the law of Islam, following carefully the Quran and all of the various commandments that Islamic people are to observe. And they were very radical people, and they believed in violence, and they were willing to suppress the enemies of Islam with force. And that was something really new in the context of Islam, to see that kind of violence. So the Muslims in Spain, who really were not all that violent, appealed to the Almoravids to come in and help them. But when the Almoravids came in from North Africa, they didn't get along with the Muslim princes because the Muslims did not quite agree with all of their tactics, and they were suspicious that they were going to try to take over, and they probably had good reason to think that. So consequently, that caused even further internal division within Islamic Spain. Meanwhile, Aragon, the Christian country of Aragon, captured the great city of Saragossa in 1118. And it was during this context, this time period, that for the first time we see Portugal emerging as a separate nation. The Portuguese speak a different Latin Romance language. So they emerge as a separate nation at this point. By the middle of the 12th century, Spain was half Muslim and half Christian. In other words, the Christians had reconquered half of Spain. Aragon, Castile, and Portugal were emerging as the three chief Christian states during this time. And then another interesting element is added. At this point, we begin to see develop the idea that the Apostle James was buried at a place called Compostela. And so Compostela becomes a site of pilgrimage, where pilgrims now come from all over Europe to a sacred place where the Apostle James was buried. And of course, the fact you have Christians pouring into Spain to go on a pilgrimage gives all the more impetus to the importance of driving the Muslims out and making Spain entirely a Christian nation. Up to this point, the Spanish church was not really Roman Catholic. Now, I mean by that their worship, their liturgy, was not the Roman Catholic liturgy. They had continued to use the Visigothic liturgy throughout all these years. So they had not fully lined up behind the Roman Catholic Church. But this is a time, if you will recall from our earlier studies, that the papacy is reviving. And under the leadership of the great Gregory VII, the papacy is trying to tighten up to create a situation where there's conformity to the Roman rule everywhere. Remember that Gregory VII was a product of the Cluny Reform movement. And so Cluny monks began to come into Spain from France now to introduce the Roman worship rites, the Roman Catholic liturgy, into the Spanish church. And I say this is really the beginning here in the 12th century of the Roman Catholic Church in Spain. The Pope insisted on the Roman usage, and the king, Alfonso VI, supported it. However, I want to make one important statement. Though it moves toward the Roman Catholic liturgy, and in one sense becomes Roman Catholic, never does it become papal. I mean by that, the Pope never has direct authority over the church in Spain. Never. And in that sense, Spain remained a very different Catholic country. As we go down through the 12th century, the Almoravids were overthrown by another group, the Almohades. And the Almohades were even more radical than the Almoravids were. And so the Almohades came in, they were ferocious. They often got high on drugs when they fought. They assassinated people. They were awful. They came in and recovered much of the territory that the Christians had taken until Alfonso VIII, who ruled between 1158 and 1214, led a counter-offensive. And finally there was a showdown battle, a decisive battle, on July 16th, 1212, at Las Navas de Tolosa, and the Muslims were defeated soundly. Then Ferdinand III, reigning in the 13th century, the king of Castile and Leon, captured Cordoba and Seville in 1248. James I of Aragon took Valencia, Majorca, and Minorca. And by 1252, the Muslims had lost all of Spain except Granada, just down in that south part of Spain, near Africa. And the Muslims managed to hold on to it for 200 years, over 200 years, until 1492. And this is when they built the Alhambra, that glorious palace, much of which is still standing in Granada. The great significance of the fact that the Spanish finally did reconquer, by the way, they call that the Reconquista, the reconquest, is that, remember, 1492 was the year that Columbus went to the New World, and that Isabella, the Queen of Castile, pawned her jewels to raise the money to send this Italian named Christopher Columbus on the expedition. And she did it for one reason, because she wanted to celebrate the conquest of Granada. And so it was, ironically, the fall of Islamic Spain that led to the discovery of the New World. And so these events are all tied together. Now, even more interestingly, that would mean that wherever the Spanish conquered in the New World, and you think of Central America and you think of South America, they would take Catholic Christianity to those areas. The golden age of Christian Spain began with the conquest of Granada and the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. And the spirit of Catholicism and Spanish nationalism under these two rulers intensified. But it was the government that controlled the church, and it was the king and queen that ran the government, and thus they ran the church. Not the Pope, as I said earlier. The Council of Castile was the religious council of the government. And any time the Pope made a decree, it had to be approved by the Council of Castile before it could go into effect. And at one point, the president of the Council of Castile boasted, "There is no Pope in Spain." And people talk about the Spanish Inquisition, which was directed against the Muslims and the Jews. It was, in fact, the government that led that, not the church. The other kings who followed, Charles I, who was really the same Charles who was Emperor of Germany at the time of Luther, didn't even speak Spanish. He later came to Spain to live where his grandparents, Ferdinand and Isabella, had been, will bring about a great period for Spain. And Philip II, the one whom Elizabeth defeated, the Battle of the Armada in 1588, a very great ruler, but also very anti-papal. And then Philip III. And it was a time of great literature. People like Cervantes, who wrote Don Quixote, Luis Vives, the humanist, St. Teresa and St. John of the Cross, two great religious leaders, El Greco and Velázquez, two wonderful painters, Lope de Vega, a playwright. But it was not a time when the Spanish were investing in industry. They invested in war instead. And they got involved in war, and eventually the French defeated them, and that was an end to the glorious days, the golden century of Spain. Now let's quickly make a conclusion here. The church in Spain was always a tool of the state. And yet Spanish missionaries followed the explorers to the New World and will convert South America, Central America, to Catholicism. The Reconquista meant then that it would be the spread of Christianity, not Islam, to the New World. If there ever was a spread to the New World, because I don't know whether the Muslims would have engaged in those explorations or not. But the way it worked out, it was the Reconquista that was the triggering event to provide for these explorations to the New World and the settlement of the New World. And yet Spanish Christians never developed the cultural and economic structure of Islamic Spain. In many ways, their behavior was less moral than the Spanish Muslims. But they left a great Catholic legacy to the Spanish-speaking world in the Americas and only one place in the Far East, the Philippines. But now, a strange thing is happening as God continues to work in almost unpredictable ways, and that is that in Central America and in South America, there is a rapid growth of evangelical Protestant Christianity, replacing the Catholic forms. Very interesting how this has all worked together.